Okay, looks like we're live. Hi, everyone. So my name is Sadiqa Watson. I am the current organizer of Our Ladies Dallas, living in the Dallas area in Texas, of course. And I'm excited to bring you this month's edition of the Our Ladies Dallas webinar series. What I like to do before we get started, because during this pandemic, we seem to be attracting people outside of Dallas, we would like you to go into the chat maybe and just kind of let us know where you're joining us from. If you're in the United States, maybe just let us know what city and state you're from. If you're in another country, maybe you could let us know which country you're representing. That's always fun to see. Um, I know before we've seen people from Turkey, from Mexico, from you know Cameroon. Um, we've got someone from Denver, Portland, Oregon, Austin, Texas, Arkansas, Fairfax, Virginia, Garland, Texas. Hello, neighbor. New York City, Mexico City, Oregon, Denton, Texas, Virginia. Okay, uh, one of the students at your university, Dr. Victor. Awesome. And we've got someone joining us from Dallas. Okay, wow. Well, wherever you are, wherever you find yourself today, I hope you're well. Definitely a lot happening today. I'm sure you're probably following the news and the news that the officer that was involved in the George Floyd case was convicted of all accounts. And so I know a lot of people have a lot of emotions about it, and we're definitely not going to get into that because that's not the purpose of today. But I'm just acknowledging that there's a lot of stuff happening today. So on top of us trying to be human, we're also just trying to be data scientists and data analysts and learn new skills. And so I'm just taking a second to acknowledge that. But I'm just happy that you're all deciding to spend some time with us. I think this is a really great opportunity for us to learn something from each other and learn things about ourselves as well. What I like to do before we get into our main event, first thing I like to do is to share my screen so that you can see the Our Ladies Dallas meetup page, which I'm sure you have visited if you have found yourself here. But just in case you weren't aware, you could visit our page to find information about some of our upcoming events. So, of course, our speaker today, Dr. Jennifer Victor. We'll talk about the content of that presentation in a minute. But we've got a couple of other presentations coming up in May and June. Brooke Watson and I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Madhu Punmu. Okay. And then guest speaker Danica Slavish, who is joining us tonight even. So welcome. I saw you in the audience. I'm glad you were able to join us. So we've got a couple of speakers lined up so you can hear more about those presentations and read those bios and abstracts and get excited about those. If you are interested in becoming a speaker, please reach out to me. We do invite anybody who's at any level. You could be maybe just kind of learning about R, and you've got just a very short 5 to 15-minute presentation maybe that you'd like to give. Maybe it's you're practicing for a conference, or you just want to show you don't want to show slides, you just want to show some R Markdown output or something in your RStudio session or something like that you thought was really cool. We definitely welcome lightning speakers is what I will call those. And we also welcome primary speakers as well. So if you're interested in either of those, please reach out to me and we can get you on the schedule. Okay, so I will stop sharing, and I think that's everything I wanted to mention before we get started. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the content of our presentation. So I'll share the background information for our esteemed speaker today, Dr. Jennifer Victor. So, oops, I don't have that. Yeah, so Dr. Victor is a professor at George Mason University, and will be talking to us about political data, network analysis in particular, and how she's able to get some insights using various R packages. On Twitter, she's Jennifer N. Victor, and all that information is available in the meetup event page. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Victor and pass it over to her.
Thank you so much, Sadiqa. It is such a pleasure to meet you and to be invited to speak with your group. I'm just kind of tickled to and kind of honored to be asked to come and speak with your group about stuff that I enjoy doing on a regular basis with my students and with my research. The networks community in political science is a really lovely group of people. Something about people who study networks seem to be a little bit more, I don't know, congenial or something like that than some of your typical academics. But I'm really happy to expand that network here today and to speak with your group. And I didn't fully know how to prep for this talk. I'm going to be totally honest. I didn't know what to assume about everybody's background on networks, on R, on everything. And so I'll just start sharing my screen here and kind of jump in. But that is to say, so I've got this whole thing planned, but I'm really happy to take your questions as we go here. Because there are some places where I go a little bit faster and I may be skipping over some steps that would be really helpful if I slowed down. You can even tap me on the shoulder and ask me to speed up through some part if it's dragging. Like, I'm totally open to making this rather conversational. And Sadiqa agreed to help point out to me some comments in the chat that I might not notice as we go along here. So by way of introduction, so I've been a political scientist. I guess I got my PhD in 2003. I was at the University of Pittsburgh for about 9 years. I've been at Mason for almost 10 now. And I got into network analysis around 2008 in a kind of an odd way. You know, back when I was in grad school, R didn't exist. I did most of my work and training in Stata for quantitative analysis. I got exposed to GIS and S+ and some other software. But in 2005, when I was an assistant professor, I did a fellowship on Capitol Hill, where I was just exposed to some, I studied Congress. I went to go sort of learn what Congress was like in real life. And I made a lot of observations during my time there that I didn't know how to bring back into my world of political analysis that was very driven by kind of traditional econometric models and very traditional statistical models that assume all sorts of independence. And I kept thinking, wow, it seems like this office and that office are co-sponsoring this bill because those two chiefs of staff used to work together for the same lobbying shop, and like all of these observations that I just didn't know what to do with. And I didn't know how to fit those observations into my training that I've had. And then in 2008, I got an invitation to attend the first annual Political Networks Conference being hosted at Harvard. At the time, it was James Fowler and David Lazar, who were both at Harvard. And I read the description of the conference and I went, oh, that's it. That's what I need to learn. And they provided a series of workshops and training in some of the packages that we'll talk about today, and then regular academic conference stuff with posters and panels and so forth. And it was just like drinking Kool-Aid. I was just hooked. I knew that this was the tool that I needed in order to study politics the way that I understood politics. Over the years, I then sort of self-trained in R and in all of these packages. So it's just kind of been by brute force. I am not the best at managing this stuff. And sometimes I still think better in Stata than in R on some days, although I haven't opened Stata in a really long time. So I'm now doing my work almost entirely exclusively in R. Part of the reason for that is because of the networks, because R is one of the best places to do network analyses. There are other software packages out there for doing network analysis, and some of them make prettier pictures. You learn to use Gephi and you can make cool 3D curvy things that look gorgeous, but it's not as sophisticated on the analytics front. So R is just a great marriage of both data management and analytics and visualizations where you can kind of get all of your needs met. And so that's why I like it so much and why I'm happy to come and chat with you about it. Okay, that was my little intro. Here's what we're going to really talk about. I want to first describe like why networks, just a little bit of motivating kind of material at the beginning to describe why we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about. And I just have to spend a few minutes talking about workflow from the science perspective and also just from the data management side. Workflow is just so important to any project of this type that I want to emphasize that. And then 90% of every project is all about managing data. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the strategies for organizing network data. And then the meat of the talk, so to speak, is talking about some specific packages for doing network analysis. Statnet and igraph are the two suites of packages that I use most often. Today, I'm going to mostly do stuff in igraph. And the example that I'm going to draw from is with campaign finance networks. I've been working with a terrifically talented undergraduate student at George Mason, who I think is in the room here tonight. I think I saw, her name is Sasha Silva, and she is with us. And she and I have been working on this project that she sort of imagined. And she and I, and her interest and my interests kind of married. And I'll describe this project that's become her honors thesis that she needs to present soon, actually, looking at campaign finance networks from the 2018 midterm congressional elections. Okay, so let me start with this motivating material about why networks. So the unit of analysis is one of the most important features of any beginning research project. The unit of analysis describes the unit of study. It might be the unit that describes what the rows in your spreadsheet are made of. And when an analytical question is focused on relationships, among different units, whether it's people or firms or whatever, or sometimes if the analytical question is focused on properties of groups, then network analysis is the proper tool. And it's important for us to use the statistical or analytical tools that meet the research questions that we have. And so under certain conditions, network analysis is the most important or the most useful tool. So if your questions are about which countries are the most likely to join a treaty, or whether or not legislators, if their voluntary relationships affect their legislative behavior, which is the topic of the book I'm writing right now, or are political donors more likely to support a party's nominee if they've done so in the past? So all of these are questions of relationships among different kinds of actors that we can use network analysis to bring insight. So often traditional statistical analysis assumes independence. Independence of observations, independence of error distribution, independence of different kinds are built into many statistical models, particularly if you live in frequentist land. And often that independence is an unreasonable assumption. Now, sometimes it's not. Sometimes we're better off making an assumption of independence and leveraging that to draw causal inference from statistical models. But there are times when the assumption of independence is just unreasonable. For the data that we're looking at. And the social and political world is a web of interdependence. And our analytical tools have to account for that. So when our questions demand that we model relationships, then network analysis is the proper tool. So here's an example of a network that I've been working with a different student who I think is not here tonight. I do a bunch of work looking at congressional caucuses because I think they're an interesting tool for examining relationships among members of Congress. So these are the congressional caucus co-memberships in the 109th Congress. But basically, politics is about relationships at its most fundamental level. So political science has been using network tools, network theory to bring new insights over the last decade or so to a deeper understanding of politics. So there's some terrific work by people like Meredith Rolfe and Betsy Sinclair that help us understand that voting is only really understandable in a social context, that it's not an independent or individual political behavior. We also know that party identification, so whether you consider yourself a Republican or a Democrat, depends strongly on your social identity, not just on your policy preferences. In a bunch of work that I and a whole lot of other people have done, we know that connections among members of Congress that are different than party connections, so party alternate connections, explain some of really important bipartisan legislative behavior. So understanding the nature of relationships can help us understand political outcomes that we're interested in. So that's why I study networks, because politics is about relationships. All right, I want to spend just a couple of minutes, if you'll forgive me. I know this can be a little bit pedantic, but I just think workflow is such an important item for any data scientist. And hopefully you appreciate the double entendre of workflow matters here. So it does matter, and these are the workflow matters. And the reason it matters is because science has to be replicable. If what I do in my scientific pursuits is not reproducible by other scientists, then I haven't really made a contribution. And so workflow helps us make our work reproducible. Workflow also helps us to avoid errors. It helps us to avoid having to retract things. It helps make our work findable. If you've ever been in the experience of feeling like there's a file that you know is on your computer someplace and you just don't know where it is because your desktop is a mess or whatever, you don't have a sufficient organization system to your workflow that you can't find stuff. And when we have problems like that, it means we wind up duplicating work. It makes our work inefficient, and it makes it harder for us to share our work with others and to work in collaborative teams, which can be really, really useful in the scientific process. So the workflow principles that I try to follow, and always fail at following, by the way, these are just sort of goals, not mantras. But these are the goals that I try to follow in my work that I find to be really indispensable when it comes to doing the type of data work that I do. So that is first to have a dedicated directory structure. So that is like one folder for each project that you're working on. That is second, to segregate data management from data analysis. And I'll give an example of that in just a second. Third, that all data changes are written in scripts. So every once in a while, we're tempted to just stick something into Excel and do it manually because that's just the easier way to do it. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes I do that too. But in reality, that's not reproducible work. And it's really easy to corrupt the integrity of your data by throwing it into Excel and making manual changes. So we need to avoid doing that and try to make all of our changes in script so that they can be reproducible. And if we do that, we need to never change the past. If you made a script, you wrote a script of code a month ago, you've made other changes since then. If you go back and re-edit that month-old code, then you're changing everything that comes after that. And so we need to avoid going back to try to edit the past. Using consistent naming conventions can really help, particularly with rerun order. And using a master file that documents what each script is, what the data is that went in, what the data is that went out, that describes what process happened in that script, and that retells a run order that could be reproduced by somebody else. All of these principles can help us make our data maintain its integrity and follow scientific principles. Okay, so just to give a couple of quick examples of how I employ these workflow principles in my own work. Here's a snapshot of my directory structure, literally the messiness that you want to hide from the rest of the world. I am now showing my vulnerabilities and my data structure. So this is literally just a screenshot from my laptop. So one of my biggest projects that I've been working on for a really long time is the polarization project that you see here. So I've got one folder for each project. Of the different types of projects that I work on. And then within my polarization folder, I have a sort of a standard set of folders for each project. So almost every one of these project folders that you would open would have a set of folders that look like this, because each project's got data and it's got documentation and it's got different drafts and it's got literature that I collect that, that speaks to my Zotero folders and so forth. So I just have this standard set of folders that help me keep track of things in my projects. And then within my data folder, which is the most important one that we're talking about here, I typically have an analysis folder and a management folder. So obviously the data folder contains data, duh, and then separate folders for analysis and management. And so let me just break those down. So in my management folder, files are scripts that are just for making changes to data. So this might be creating new variables or reshaping data or cleaning data, sort of some of the standard procedures that you might do. And I don't know about you, but I find that this type of work is essentially 90% of what I do in any project. It takes an enormous amount of time and exploring and making mistakes and re-exploring and visualizing what you need to do to the data to get it to whatever goal you're trying to get at. And keeping track of the changes that you make to your data during that process is really critical. And that's what I do here. You'll notice that I'm also using naming conventions that assure run order, so that if I got hit by a bus, somebody else could rerun all of these scripts in that same order and essentially recreate my data set as it existed 6 months ago and as it exists today. And so that's a really important part of the scientific reproducibility process. In my analysis folder, then I've got some other tidbits. So in the analysis folder, I have all of my scripts that are for statistical models and creating graphs and summary statistics and visualizations and so forth. And changes that are made to data in these files technically are not saved, right? So if you need to save your data, then that goes in a management or a creation folder or file or script. But in your analysis files, you're not changing data, you're just analyzing it. And then I usually store my output and my visualizations separately to keep all that organized. And then when I name each of these scripts, you can see this folder is old enough that those beginning scripts there are all status scripts. That's what the SMCL suffix is. And it's alphabetized. So you can see there's a AN APSA 2013. So that's a script I wrote for analysis that I presented at an American Political Science Association meeting in 2013. That's how old this project is. And I've been working on it forever. And it's had some output since then, but hopefully more to come. Okay, so I will often use the prefix AN for analysis files and the prefix CR for management files. So the CR stands for creation. These are habits that I adopted from Robert Long's work on data management and workflow. So the naming conventions are key to scientific workflow because it ensures run order and the organization. Okay, so I'll get off my pedantic soapbox about workflow. If those are tips that are new to you or that you want to hear more about, I'm happy to share other resources. I just think it's really important. I don't think you can do this type of work without having some principles that you follow, some rules that you follow in your own your own workspace for keeping this stuff straight. Okay, so now let me turn to, yeah, go ahead.
Victor, yeah, no, I have never seen this kind of directory structure before. I think it's super helpful. Someone in the chat agreed that this is great. You gave a reference, Robert Long. Was there a book or something in particular that you would recommend?
Yeah, he's got a book. I don't know if I can pull it up on the fly. Is my Zotero open? Let me see if I can pull it up on the fly because it should be in my Zotero. Oh, you know what? My presentation mode is going to make that difficult. So I won't try to pull it up on the fly. Yeah. But yes, there is a book and I can give you a reference. And I can sort of put it in the show notes if you want. I'll give you the reference after the talk.
Perfect. Thank you.
And thanks for interrupting me. I actually can't see the chat. So please feel free to do that again if something else comes up.
Okay. Yep. Thanks.
Okay. So next I'm going to move on to organizing data. So let me just start with a little bit of a couple of tidbits about how network data is different than some data that you may be traditionally used to working with. So in network data, you essentially have two main types of features. You have nodes, which are the actors or the units that take actions or that hold attributes or characteristics. And you have edges, and these are the ties or the connections between the nodes. So nodes and edges are these two key features of network data. So the nodes, they might be cases, they might be individuals, they might be units or agencies or countries. It's again, that's sort of the unit of analysis. Nodes often have attributes. They might have gender or age or marital status or political affiliation or whatever it is. And nodes then are often in networks connected by edges. So edges describe the relationships between the nodes, and relationships can come in many forms. They might be shared attributes like shared gender or shared marital status or shared political behavior. They might be people who went to the same event. They might be transactions between people, senders and receivers, which is what we're going to have in the network data I show later. But key to any network project is, this sounds really simple to just break it down to nodes and edges, but I can't emphasize enough that any network research project comes down to being very careful and specific about defining the nodes and edges of your project. Edges can be directed or undirected. So a directed edge is like a transaction where the ties are go from one person to the next. And directed edges can be reciprocal or one directional, or some relationships are non-directed. If it's a shared attribute, if it's two people that have the same gender, you might consider that a tie or an edge, but it's not a directed edge. I can say more about nodes and edges. In network projects, we typically think of the unit of analysis as being of three potential types. So your unit of analysis in a network study is either your questions are about the nodes and you're studying nodes, or your questions about the relationships. And those might be projects that are focused on dyads, which I do a lot of work in, or your network study might be focused on the third unit of analysis in a network project, which is the graph level or the network itself, because networks themselves have properties. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute, but network properties are really one of the most intriguing and important features of a network study that we can talk about as we go here. Okay, how else is network data different from data that you might be accustomed to? So traditional data, I think of as being rectangular. It exists in a rectangular matrix where the rows are observations or some unit of study, and the columns are variables that describe maybe some attributes of those observations. Network data is square. So in network data, you see Alice, Paul, and John here make up both the titles of the rows and the titles of the columns. So this is an n by n matrix where the values in the cells describe the relationship between the nodes. So again, those are the edges, and those edges might describe a transaction. They might describe a shared attribute. They might describe some sort of relationship. But this would be called a one-mode matrix, where the values of the cells describe the relationship or the edge between the nodes. Okay, but because we've got these square matrices, we can leverage a bit of matrix algebra to help us do conversions between traditional data to network data. So for example, let's suppose I have a network of 3 members of Congress. We'll call them Ryan, McCarthy, and Pelosi. If you know anything about politics, those names might be meaningful to you. Those are 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, one former Speaker of the House, 1 current Speaker of the House, and 1 current majority or minority leader. Okay, so we have Ryan, McCarthy, and Pelosi, and let's say HR1, HR2, and HR3 are bills. And the ones and the zeros describe the vote that they took on the bill. So on HR1, Ryan and McCarthy voted yay, Pelosi voted nay. On HR2, Ryan and McCarthy voted nay, Pelosi voted yay. And on HR3, Ryan and Pelosi voted yes, and McCarthy voted no. Okay, so this is just a matrix, a traditional matrix that describes voting on bills. But what I actually want is to use this roll call data from the bill votes to tell me something about the relationships between these 3 political actors. So we can use some matrix algebra magic. If we take the transpose of this matrix that we call A, so to transpose a matrix is to simply switch the rows and the columns. So if I make the columns now the HR1, 2, and 3, or excuse me, the rows become HR1, 2, and 3, and the columns become Ryan, McCarthy, and Pelosi. If I multiply matrix A by the transpose of matrix A, what I get is this. It's an n by n, or it's the row by row matrix that describe the relationship. So the main diagonal there is telling me how many times each person voted yay. And the number in the cell is telling me how many votes each pair shared, right? So McCarthy and Ryan voted yes, or voted the same number of times. If I had done the A transpose times A, I would have had a bill by bill matrix rather than a member by member matrix. So the matrix algebra is really useful for converting traditional data into the square matrices that we need for network analysis. And sometimes in R, I can do this stuff by hand if I've got like basics that I just need to toy with. But I'm going to show you some shortcuts that might allow us to skip some matrix algebra using R packages. Okay, so let me get into the R portion of the talk, really, looking at some packages and some examples. Okay, so there are two really common packages in R for using network data. Statnet is a terrific suite of packages that is not, it's not just one package, it's a whole community of packages that some of them emphasize visualization, some of them emphasize different analytical techniques. Statnet is probably, in my estimation, one of the best packages for doing advanced analysis with networks, which we're not going to get into today, but you can do exponential random graph models and other sorts of statistical models that account for relational dependencies between statistical objects that can be really useful for drawing inference. igraph is the package I'm going to talk about today. igraph has a really intuitive syntax if you're already familiar with base R, and it's great for both managing data and visualizing data, and it's just, it's got a lot of flexibility, and some people find it a bit easier to learn, perhaps than some of the alternatives, and so that's the one I'm going to focus on today. Okay. I have to do a little bit of campaign finance 101. Campaign finance is a topic that I'm particularly enthusiastic about. I find it really fascinating and a great tool for studying politics. But if you don't know anything about this world, in order to make these examples resonate, I'm just going to explain a little bit of what we've got going on here. So, as I said before, the reason networks are so cool to study is because networks have properties. They have mathematical properties that we can observe in data. And those mathematical properties have implications for the political and social world. And so I want to use theory to drive my expectations about what I will observe in the network data. So in the project that I've been working on with Sasha Silva, who's on the call today, we're exploring a hypothesis about the Democratic Party. And today I want to talk about how the Democratic Party networks might differ from Republican Party networks and why we might expect them to differ and how we can observe that in the data. So the theory here is that Democratic Party networks exhibit more clustering in the network, whereas Republican Party networks are going to exhibit more hierarchical structure. Why would I expect Democrats to show more clustering and Republicans to show more hierarchy? It comes down to, in a network, clustering is associated with resilience, with flexibility, and with a sort of diversity. And when we think about the Democratic coalition and the various interests that it represents, we can build on theories. I don't know if you can actually see my camera, but there's this terrific book, for example, by Matt Grossman and David Hopkins about asymmetric politics, where they advance a theory about political parties that suggests the Democratic Party is sort of a coalition of various interest groups and people who are pursuing different kinds of policies, whereas the Republican Party is more of a coalition of ideologies and is much more sort of firm in its structure and less pliable to some outsiders. And so based on, and I'm not going to go too far into the political science, but basically based on the theory of how we understand these parties to operate, I have these expectations about what that means we should observe in the campaign finance data. And in the data today, campaign finance data, I should say, is horrifically messy. A lot of it is publicly available from the Federal Election Commission, but it's really messy to operate with. And it comes in a lot of different forms because the campaign finance system itself is very complicated. And so I'm going to focus on one narrow slice of it today, and that is what we call leadership PACs. So a leadership PAC is a political action committee that is owned by a member of Congress, an incumbent member of Congress, who, so if I'm a member of Congress, I may have a campaign committee where I'm raising money for my own reelection that I go and spend on whatever I'm spending on to get myself reelected. But I may also have a leadership PAC that's separate from my reelection committee. And what do I do with my leadership PAC? I gather donations, and then I take those donations and I dole them out to other members of my party that I want to promote or advance or help. This is essentially how Nancy Pelosi became an important figure in the Democratic Party. She's an incredible fundraiser. She raised an incredible amount of money over the years through her leadership PAC. She doled it out to Democrats that she thought had a good chance of winning or that she wanted to support in some way. And then once those Democrats got elected, they felt kind of indebted to her. And so through this process of using her leadership PAC to finance many of her co-Democrats over the years, she became a really sort of powerful central player in the Democratic Party. And that's sort of the very short story of how Nancy Pelosi became the Speaker of the House. But if all of that is true, we should see it in the data. We should see it in the leadership PAC data. Okay. So as I said, the Federal Election Commission makes these data available, and you can download it straight from the FEC. I'm friendly with this organization called the Center for Responsive Politics, which if you're familiar with any of this, you may know as opensecrets.org. And in full disclosure, I actually serve on the board of directors of this organization, and I have for about 5 years. It's a totally voluntary position. It has, it's just really coincidence. It's because I'm an academic and I like these data and I work and I write in this field that they invited me to join their board. But it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. And basically they take FEC data, they clean it and they make it publicly available. So they're in the mission of making all of this more transparent for the public. They have an API that, sort of in the spirit of transparency, they try to make as much data as available to data scientists as they can. So particularly if you have a non-commercial purpose, as I do, you can use their bulk data download. My animation's just messed up because I had another, sorry, technical glitch. Here, there we go. So the bulk data is available for non-commercial use. And so that's where I got the data that we're going to look at today. And the data, as I said, are going to be these leadership PAC contributions to candidates. Okay. But getting the data into its desired form is a non-trivial task, because what we get from Open Secrets are these cleaned tables that come from the Federal Election Commission. And there are tables on from disclosed candidates, from candidate committees, different kinds of campaign committees, from political action committees. There's 5 or 6 different tables for each election cycle. And the unit of analysis in these tables is very confusing, right? I want nodes and edges, and that's not how these data come. Sometimes a record is from a donor. Sometimes a record is from a recipient. The reason the data are so confusing is because of all of the legal requirements that candidates and donors have for disclosure. And the FEC just sort of spits it all out in a fairly non-friendly form. Open Secrets does a pretty nice job of cleaning the data and making some summaries and tables out of it. But when you get the bulk data, there's a lot of nastiness in there and you have to weed through it. And so I want to talk about that. The tables that Center for Responsive Politics or Open Secrets provides are relational tables, but they don't provide a schema in their codebook. So I basically, you have to just weed through it to try to figure out how the tables are connected to one another. So that's what's available. But what I need are nodes and edges. So I want nodes that are members of Congress from the 115th Congress. These are people that were running for election in 2018, which is the sample that we're looking at here. And I want the edges to be the contributions from members to members. So members of Congress, incumbents who are running to other incumbents who are running. That's the network that I want to look at. So I want to look at their leadership PACs. Now, here it gets complicated again, because leadership PAC data or leadership PACs can give to other leadership PACs. So that's one network that I want to look at. But leadership PACs could also give to each incumbent's candidate committee. And there's other versions of this as well, but these are the 2 main types of connections that I want to look at. So let's go. Let's talk about how we're going to get these data in this form. So data processing. Like I said, this is 90%. Okay, what I have here is one huge markdown file that talks about the data processing and one huge markdown file that talks about the data analysis. As I explained to Sadiqa, I'm happy to share those giant markdown files with you, but I thought it might be easiest to just give you snapshots and sort of try to walk you through the process. So I'm just going to share sort of the tidbits of the markdown files here that describe how I get there. Please feel free to interrupt me and ask me to slow down or back up through any of this. I still have, about 30 slides left, so I do want to kind of get through this, but I also want to make it comprehensible, and so I'm trying to find the balance here. Okay. So markdown, so start by cleaning your space and loading the data. So this packother.18 CSV file is raw data that comes from Open Secrets. So we're just going to start by opening the data. Tidyverse is your friend. So often people who are R users come on different teams. You might be a base R team. You might be a tidyverse team. You might be a data table team. I don't know. People have different preferences that they develop. And to me, this is the blessing and the curse of R. It's a blessing because these packages, these sort of philosophies for organizing data and using these packages become almost religion for people who really get into it. And you get familiar with their quirks and their utilities, and that's great, that's the blessing. But the curse is that there's 15 ways to do anything in R, and you learn it in base R one way, and in tidyverse another way, and in data table another way, and so on and so forth. And that can make it really confusing as to it makes it hard personally for me to remember how to do anything in R, because I forget which universe it came from. And I kind of want to know all the universes at once, and that's my own curse. Okay, but tidyverse is really useful for network data because it's got great tools that allow us to pipe the data through these different transformations that we need to do for filtering and selecting and reshaping from one version of the data to another. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do with the data is filter it down so that I'm only looking at leadership packs. So I read through the Open Secrets codebook and I find out that this field that they called reshape prim code, basically the reshape prim codes that start with J2 are those that are for leadership packs. So I'm just going to start with a data set that includes, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, I forget, observations, filter it down for just the leadership packs so that I'm looking at the smaller universe that I care about. And then I can look at the levels of those leadership packs to unpack them a little bit. Okay, and then I sort of investigate and do this deep reading of the code book and figure out this really confusing organization for the leadership pack to leadership pack files. If the recipient ID is the same as the other ID in any record, then that record is from a donor. And the recip field indicates who the recipient was. But if the recipient ID does not equal the other ID field, then that record is from a recipient and the donor is indicated in the other ID field. Okay, and I only figured that out by this deep reading of the code book, and it's terribly confusing. But because of that confusing nature of the data, I walked through all of this sort of piped code, and I thought I had this. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I didn't mean to overlap those, so you couldn't read the whole thing. The little error in my animation. But basically what I'm doing here is morphing this into an edge list, right? An edge list is the edges. I want donor recipient pairs. And so I'm going to filter down to the donors, and then I'm going to select out just the columns that I need in order to come up with what I want, which is donor recipient amount. That gives me the edges that I need in the data. And then from those edges, I want to isolate who the nodes are. Again, it's all about nodes and edges. It's all about figuring out who the nodes and the edges are. So I need to isolate the nodes and identify their attributes. And so this little set of code here is creating an object that I called node ats for node attributes, where I'm first I'm just arranging the leadership pack nodes, filtering out just the people who were House members because the data also includes senators, people who are running for Senate. And I'm merging it with other poli-sci data that I've got. So the other sort of terrible tragedy of these data is that the identifiers that are in these are common identifiers that the FEC use and that Open Secrets use, but they are not common identifiers that match with common data sets in political science. So for example, in the FEC data and the Open Secrets data, Nancy Pelosi has a candidate ID. Her candidate ID starts with N something, and then it's like a 7-digit number. And then her committee for her candidate committee for both her leadership pack and her re-election campaign committee, those also have identifiers that start with C and then like a 7-digit number. And we have to match that candidate ID and her two different committees with what I call her ICPSR ID number. So ICPSR is a data center that housed at University of Michigan that just houses a whole bunch of congressional data. And they have, to me, sort of the universe of data about individual characteristics for members of Congress. So I can get their party, their state, their district, all sorts of individual level data, attributes about members of Congress. But I need to merge that attribute data with this messy campaign finance data. And the only way I can do that is to convert those identifiers into ICPSR numbers. And so in full transparency here, we wind up doing that by hand. We didn't have to. We could have done, sort of dealt with all the messiness of managing text data in R. But frankly, Sasha took a night or two out of her schedule and sat down and matched those identifiers to ICPSR numbers so we could get this really cleanly done. Okay, but once that is done, we can create edges and nodes. And so here I create an object that I call ID crosswalk or ID.xwalk, where I'm matching up the ICPSR IDs to the committee IDs. And then using that crosswalk, I can go through a series of merges that will allow me to wind up merging the ICPSR numbers into the donor field and then the ICPSR numbers into the recipient field, so that what I wind up with are donors and recipients that have the IDs, the ICPSR IDs that I can match to the other political science data, which is ultimately what I need. Okay. So I capture the leadership pack. So that's one network, right? That's the leadership pack to leadership pack network. But I also have a network that's leadership pack to the candidate committee transactions. So again, I load new data from Open Secrets and I sort of redo everything that I just did, but this time with a separate data table. That is the campaign finance table. So again, it's sort of the same set of procedures where I'm using the features of tidyverse, filtering down so that I'm winding up with just the leadership packs that are just the packs that are leadership packs, because frankly, there's also packs that are non-leadership packs. And I want the candidate IDs that are just the candidates that they're incumbent members of Congress. Because remember, there's all sorts of challenger candidates out there that aren't sitting members of Congress, and we don't care about them. We're throwing them out. So again, we're filtering down to just the network that we want that's driven by our theory. Our theory is telling us which nodes and edges that we want to keep in order to get to the analysis that we want. Okay, I'm going to speed this up so that I don't go too long here. So I'm merging in a bunch of these different IDs, and then I leave myself a little table at the end of this markdown file that says, here are my networks. I've got leadership packs to leadership packs. I define the nodes, I define the edges, and I remind myself which CSV files I've stored those in, and so that I can move those into my analysis section. Okay, that's the data process portion, and then I move into data analysis. Right. So we actually haven't. Yeah, please go ahead.
So what's
the place for questions?
Yeah, I was just wondering, what's the structure of the final result of that data manipulation step?
Oh, great. Yeah, I should have taken screenshots of that. So the, whoops. So for example, the lpack edges.csv that's down here. I don't know, can you see my cursor as it moves? I don't know. So that is a 3-column. So and I forget how many rows it is, but it's like, let's call it, let's say it's 500 by 3, right? So it's got all of each row in that matrix is an edge. Mm-hmm. And so it's dyad. So I've got, the first column is the donor and the second column is the recipient, and the third column is the amount of money that went from that donor to that recipient.
Okay.
And that's what all the edges files are there. They're all just 3 columns. They're I would call it a weighted edge list, which is how we're going to treat it in the analysis section. And the nodes files, these 3 nodes files here, are much more like traditional statistical sort of data. That's an incidence matrix or a 2-mode matrix, whatever, I don't know what terms you all are familiar with. But each row is a member of Congress and each column is some attribute about that member of Congress.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Great, any other questions before I go on?
Nothing else in the chat, but yeah, feel free to type questions and I'll forward them to our speaker if you have any.
Awesome. Okay. So just to remind yourself here of where we're going, because I want this analysis to be theory driven, and I can talk about the huge dangers of doing just raw data mining with network data. You can get yourself into all sorts of scary territory, it can be useful and it can be exploratory and people do it all the time, but you can also make wildly incorrect inferences. And so I want my analysis to be theory-driven and not just exploratory and data mining. So features of political parties that determine candidates will be evident in the network structure. That's the theory. So Democrats are going to be resilient to outsiders and be clumpy, and Republicans are going to be driven by ideologies and hierarchical, because that's what the literature tells me to expect. All right. So, and we're going to examine two different networks. So the leadership PACs are these campaign contribution organizations that are controlled by incumbent members of Congress. And the network one is going to be the individual leadership PACs contributions to other individual leadership PACs. So it's literally member to member contributions. And network two is leadership PACs to incumbents candidate committees. So it's still a member to member contribution. It's just not going to their leadership PAC. It's going to their re-election campaign, essentially. Okay, so let's go with the analysis. So I start by clearing my workspace, setting my working directory, and loading up the tidyverse. And I remind myself what my nodes and my edges are. I leave lots of commentary in here to remind myself the steps as I'm going. And I start by just loading the nodes and the edges for the leadership PAC to leadership PAC network. So these are all the members of the 115th Congress who were running as incumbents during the 2018 midterm election. And just to remind yourself, if you're not familiar with the political history here, this was an election that was the midterm election in Donald Trump's administration. So Trump was elected president in 2016, Republican Congress came in with him. And then in 2018, the Democrats were trying to take back the House and the Senate from Republican control. So Republicans are in the majority and Democrats were trying to assert control. And so the data are the making and receiving contributions to fellow members of Congress through their leadership PACs. So these are 163 members of the House of Representatives. And the edges are the leadership PAC to leadership PAC contributions, aggregated by pairs. So each edge is not an individual contribution, but if I'm Nancy Pelosi and you're Kevin McCarthy, this wouldn't happen. No, you're Jerry Nadler, and I give a contribution to you, but maybe I give you $500 in September and then I give you $1,000 in December. I want to count that as one edge and I'm going to add it up. I'm going to aggregate it and call it $1,500. I don't want each contribution to be an edge. I want the aggregated sum to be an edge. And so we've got sort of each pair is unique in that sense and aggregated. Okay, so we've got our nodes and edges loaded. Now I'm going to load igraph. We're this far into the talk and I'm finally loading igraph. Sigh of relief from the crowd. Okay, so igraph has this cool feature where I can just tell it to create a network object from a data frame. So I'm not going to do all the matrix algebra by hand. igraph is going to do it for me. I just have to identify, I have to tell igraph what the edges are and what the nodes are. And so here the edges are going to be the leadership PACs. The nodes or vertices is the terminology that igraph uses are going to be the nodes. And I'm going to tell it, sorry. I'm going to tell it that the network is directed. So we've got donors and recipients. And then I can look at the class of that object and it tells me it is an object that is an igraph object. And I can look at the summary. And I'm not going to break down what all of these little codes here mean, but essentially this is a little information about it being a directed network with 163 nodes and 252 edges. And I've got names associated with those nodes because there were names in the node file. And then I can just sort of look at the object as sort of the header of the object to make sure it looks like what I want, and it looks exactly like edges. These little 5-digit numbers are the ICPSR ID numbers for each member of Congress. So each one of these numbers stands for a member of Congress. Okay, once that's in, I can draw my first network. And so just a quick, easy plot here. igraph has a command that's just plot, and I give it my igraph object as the first argument in that function. And I could have closed my function there and just plotted that, but I wanted to give it a little bit of instruction about which algorithm to use for the layout. You know, I want to make the arrows a little bit tiny, otherwise and to leave the labels off of the graph, otherwise it just looks like a collection of labels and you can't see the nodes. And here I just want to see some basic structure. So we see a little bit of structure in this graph. But there's one big clump, we call that a component of connected nodes at the center of the graph, and some other isolates and other clusters around the periphery of the graph. And so we can get into how to interpret that as we go here. But I can't really see much in this graph yet. It just looks like spaghetti so far. So let's add in some vertex attributes. One of the nice things about igraph is you can treat the network object using a similar syntax as you would use in base R. So here I can treat name, party, ID, and ideology as like a subset. So I can use the $ subsetting feature in base R in igraph to assign a vertex attribute or a node attribute. So the capital V tells igraph that means I'm talking about the vertex associated with my igraph object. So this says, take the vertex associated with the inet.1, which is the name of my graph object, and subset for the name, and assign to that the biographical name that comes from that node file that I loaded earlier. And so I'm just assigning these 4 different attributes to my network object. And so igraph, again, has this easy notation for setting and also then later recalling the attributes of nodes, which it calls vertices, which is very similar to the subsetting used in base R. Okay, when you've got network data, or any data really, often the first thing you want to know is how is it distributed? So in network data, we're often curious about the degree distribution. So in network parlance, degree simply means that how many connections a node has. So if I am one node and I gave to 5 different people, I am a node of degree 5. And we often want to know what's the distribution of the degree of all the nodes in the network. And so I can just run a straight histogram of the degree of my network object, my igraph object. And you'll notice this is essentially a very exponential distribution, right? So we've got a lot of nodes that have either 0 or 1 connection, and very few nodes out here in the extreme. So this is a very exponential distribution, which is exactly what we would expect. If this was standard independently observed data, we would expect a normal distribution because we would expect the central limit theorem to kick in. But this is not independently observed data. This is network data where we are literally trying to model the dependencies of these observations. And so at the outset, we expect this distribution to follow a power law distribution or an exponential function. So that's why it looks so logarithmic. So this sort of passes my smell test. It's exactly what we would expect. Okay, so now let's plot our network again, but this time let's plot it by adding an argument to our plot function that tells igraph to use red and blue to assign parties. So in my data, party equals 100 is for Democrats. And so this is just a little bit of syntax here that looks more complicated than it should be. But this is how I'm assigning the red and blue colors to the nodes. So now the red dots are the Republicans and the blue dots are the Democrats. And wow, all of a sudden I have an observation. So these are transactions between the leadership PACs. And like, it looks to me like, oh, I thought I had a different note here, but like the Republicans are at the center of this graph. So on the one hand, the Republicans were the majority party. There were literally more Republicans in Congress than Democrats at this time, but their leadership PACs are way more active here than the Democratic leadership PACs, which is an interesting observation. Because the other thing you might remember is that the Democrats won this election big time. So the Republicans controlled Congress, but in terms of campaigning, the Democrats took over the majority at the end of this election. So we might expect that there would be more, some activity that we observe in that Democratic network. Okay. The next thing I want to do is think about the size of those network nodes, because we can visualize features of a network or properties of a network using some statistics, some summary statistics that we can draw from the network. So betweenness is a network term that we use to describe a network, or excuse me, a node in a graph that is this just sounds obvious, but it's between other nodes, right? So if I'm in the center and Sasha's on one side and Sadiqa's on the other, then I am between them. I am a bridge between them. So nodes that have high betweenness centrality, and I won't get into the mathematics of it, but it's a relatively straightforward algorithm that igraph calculates for us. But nodes that have high betweenness centrality might be expected to be more influential or have higher status in a network than nodes that have low betweenness centrality, that are on the periphery of the network. So I want to look at this network and make each node size according to its betweenness characteristic. And so I calculate the betweenness, I look at its distribution, and then I plot it on the graph. And when I do that, you can see here I added an argument for vertex size, where I added betweenness as an attribute of the network. And I divided it by 7 because actually, if I didn't do that, those big nodes, essentially there's a couple of huge outliers here. And a couple of them are notable members of Congress. So what I see here is there are some Republicans that have huge betweenness, edge betweenness in this graph. And the Democrats are teeny tiny little dots on the periphery for the most part. Okay, so Republicans rule this network. That's what I get by plotting this by plotting the size according to betweenness centrality. And here's where I remind you that Republicans were the majority prior to the 2018 election, where Democrats became the majority. Okay,
another question.
So now, yeah, go ahead.
On the previous slide, 2 questions actually. Yeah, one, like that little point at the top that sort of looks like it's got an edge going to itself. Could you say a little bit more about that? And then also in the arguments in the plot command, where it says remove loops equals true, what is that doing?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that. So this is actually a little puzzle for me because so the arrow that appears to go from a node back into that node is known as a self loop. So probably that is a leadership pack that transferred money. You know, it's like when you got your checking account and you're balancing your checkbook, if anybody does that anymore, and you transferred money from one of your accounts to another account. And so in your checkbook, in your checking account, it looks like you had an influx of $1,000 and then you spent $1,000, when in reality, all you did was move money from one account to another. So that self loop is that type of accounting. It's somebody moving money around somehow. And so it looked like a transfer into and out of the same node. But I didn't want, I thought those transfers are kind of distracting. And in the processing, I thought I removed all of the transfers. And in the arguments in the function here, in the plot function, I put remove.loops equals true because that is supposed to remove the self loops. So the fact that I know the loop is in there, I told the function, the plot function, to remove the loop, and yet it still appeared in the graph is totally puzzling to me. I actually don't know why it's doing that. It should be removed. So it says to me that the argument isn't working in the function, and I actually don't know why.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Sure. I should also say, and I should have said this before, this is very much a work in progress. Like Sasha has to present this in her honors thesis within the next few weeks, but we're going to continue to work on this paper, and it's, you know, it's not ready for prime time. So I'm happy for all of your review comments as we try to figure out how to make sense of all this. So you're just seeing the dirty laundry stage. Okay, so what I want to do now is break the network apart and look at the Republican network separate from the Democratic network, because it looks like they have really different structures. So how many are in each party? So 100 equals Democrat and 200 equals a Republican. So here I've got 42 Democrats out of the 193 that were in that Congress, and 121 Republicans out of the 235. So what this tells me is that not all members of Congress had leadership PACs, right? So it's actually a minority of Democrats that had leadership PACs. For the Republicans, it's almost a majority, or I guess it is a majority, but it's still just more than half. So there's still a lot of members of Congress that aren't using leadership PACs that are reported in these data. Okay, so I isolated out the Democratic network. I didn't show this part for sake of time, but I created a new network object that I called inetd. So these are just the Democratic members of Congress in the 115th Congress that had leadership PACs that gave money to other Democrats. Okay, and what you can see here is some names pop out at you. So look, Mike Doyle, and I should have done this in a way that I could zoom in, but this is all from the markdown file, so I can't zoom. But Mike Doyle has got this nice little star structure going. So there's this component in the graph here where you've got Mike Doyle that's got high betweenness centrality. You can also notice Kristen Sinema is in this graph. She's now a senator, but back then in this election, she was a member of the House. And she's got pretty high betweenness centrality. So I've only labeled, oh, this isn't betweenness, sorry, this is the degree. So the nodes are sized here according to their degree. So if you gave or received more money, your node is a larger size. So these are the Democrats that were more active in this network. Now you notice these are not leaders of the Democratic Party. Mike Doyle is like a rank and file member of Congress from Pennsylvania. When I lived in Pittsburgh, he was my member of Congress, I think. Is that right? I think so. Kristen Sinema, you know, obviously an ambitious member of Congress because she was later elected to the Senate, but you know, by House standards, really just a rank and file member. So it's not like we're looking at Nancy Pelosi here. And there's just not a ton of activity. There's just not a lot of structure to go off of. These are rank and file members of Congress. We can plot the Republican network by degree, and we get a much more interesting picture. There's quite a bit more structure going on here. And I didn't jitter the labels enough here, but you could, excuse me, you can see Kevin McCarthy is in there, Kathy McMorris Rodgers is in there. Those are party leaders. So the Republicans with high degree in this graph are the party leaders. And so that's, there's more structure and there's sort of more meaning that we can make out of the structure.
Hey, Dr. Victor, we've got a question
Yes.
in the chat. Have you considered which centralities would help explain these networks? I always wonder how to differentiate between the centralities that we can compute and that would tie with the question we're posing with the data.
Terrific question. And I like the way that the questioner asked it, because I do think that again, the analytical approach that we use should be driven by our question or the theory that we're trying to advance. And when after the talk, you know, I'm going to email these to Sadiqa, and you can look at the full markdown file. But you can see I was mostly exploring in the data with degree centrality and betweenness centrality. And that's basically because I think those are the two that are likely to speak to the most relevant aspects of these data. The other thing is these are directed data. So when you're looking at centrality measures, you want to think about whether your data are directed or non-directed, because different centrality scores can be used with different types of data. And with directed data, degree centrality and betweenness centrality are the most meaningful, I think. I could have looked at eigenvector centrality. I actually never calculated that for this graph. Eigenvector centrality is more networky really than degree. So degree centrality is not that interesting. It's just how many connections that you have. Eigenvector centrality actually looks at the eigenvector of each of those degrees and sort of accounts for second and third level sort of indirect connections where a node is in relation to the other nodes of the graph, and can give you a stronger sense of sort of power or status. Eigenvector centrality might be an interesting statistic to calculate on these data. I actually haven't tried that yet. I was most interested in betweenness centrality, mostly because a lot of the work that I do has to do with bipartisanship, and I'm always interested in the places where the Republicans and the Democrats differ. And so betweenness centrality is often a characteristic in there. So probably, in all honesty, it's more out of habit that I stuck with betweenness and degree in these data. I think eigenvector centrality is also a good one to look at here. I don't think I would use closeness centrality. I don't know that that would be any more meaningful than the others. But in any case, like, have a theory that gives you a reason to look at a particular kind of centrality, and pay attention to which types of centrality are most appropriate for the type of data you have, directed and non-directed. Okay, but as you recall, our sort of hypothesis of interest had to do with clumpiness or clusters. I was expecting the Democratic network to be more clustery than the Republican network. So is membership in a particular cluster? Oh, and actually Sasha's hypothesis that we haven't fully finished teasing out yet is whether or not membership in a particular cluster is consistent with ideological alignment. So for example, could we go into the Democratic caucus in Congress and say, here's the progressives, and here's the blue dogs, and here's the New Democrats, and would each of those clusters in the members of Congress, each of those coalitions, sort of internal party factions, would we see that reflected in the campaign finance data? So are the progressives all donating to one another? Are the New Democrats all donating to one another, for example? So the structure that we observe or that we anticipate in the real world, is that reflected in their campaign finance behavior? And I actually don't have an answer to that one yet. That's sort of the part that Sasha's still working on. But we have some beginning hints of it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is use a set of functions in igraph that are for community detection analysis. And this goes by a bunch of names. We can call it cluster analysis, we can call it community detection, we can call it modularity, but whichever term we're using, they all essentially look for the same thing, which is how clumpy, how clustered are the data. Is it one big component? Does it have a hierarchical structure to it, or is it really clustered? And I'm expecting the Democratic network to be really clustered. Here again, kind of like with centrality measures, the clustering algorithms, there's almost a dozen different types of clustering algorithms as well. So here again, you can either be a little bit experimental. I do think it's important to try to be theory driven. For directed data, modularity actually works better with non-directed data, I think. But for directed data, I looked at betweenness clustering, the betweenness algorithm, and the infomap algorithm. But if you look in the igraph package, they list all the different terms that are available for cluster analysis. But here I used the IMAP algorithm, and I calculated the clustering on the Democratic network and on the Republican network, and look at that. We actually confirm our expectations. So the clustering in the Democratic network is 76%, despite the fact that there appeared to be some lack of activity and structure there. And among the Republicans, it's only 23%. So despite the smaller network, the Democrats show greater clustering than Republicans, which is what our theory suggested. So that's sort of, we all do a little happy dance when the data meet our expectations. Okay, then I can try to visualize those clusters. And I should have taken the labels off this graph. It would be a little bit easier to read. But you can see it's just difficult to visualize. There's so many clusters going on that are individualistic rather than, so this network would probably benefit from parsing it down, getting rid of some of those isolates and parsing it down to some of these clusters and looking at the members. And we haven't dug down that far yet, but that's sort of next on the list. And the Republican network is also difficult to visualize. You can, again, get a sense of one giant cluster there and then these other isolates off to the side. Okay, fast forward. That was network one. Remember, network one was leadership packs to leadership packs. Now I want to look at network two, which is leadership packs to candidate committees. And actually what I'm going to do here is, and I don't show all of this, but I calculate the leadership pack to candidate committees data, and then I joined it together with the leadership pack to leadership pack data. So I actually aggregated them, because what I wanted to do was to try to get the fullest network, the fullest data perspective possible on the member-to-member contribution behavior, whether it was to leadership pack or to candidates. What's the member-to-member network look like? So I aggregate all of that up. I have new nodes and new edges. That's all of that stuff aggregated. I dump it into igraph, and I use my graph from data frame, so I don't have to do the matrix algebra. I tell it what the nodes are, what the edges are. And actually here, this node file that I'm using, the first column is the IDs of the nodes. And then there are, I don't know, maybe a dozen other columns in this data frame, each of which is a separate attribute. So it's like party and ideology and state and district number and so forth, and their name. And igraph will actually recognize that the first column is the IDs of the vertices, and all the additional columns are attributes, and it'll automatically add those in as attributes of the network. So I don't have to write a new line of code that sets each attribute like I was showing you before. It just does it automatically. So that saves us some coding. Okay, so quick and easy plot here like we did with the other one. Oh, gee, look, I wonder what those two clusters might be. Now with this data aggregated, there's a lot more activity in the leadership pack to candidate committee data. And now all of a sudden I have two giant clusters. And I can add the party attribute data in here, color those by party, and lo and behold, we've got a Republican cluster and a Democratic cluster. Now, again, there are some oddities that I'd like to explore that I you're going to ask these questions and I should have answers for you yet, and I just don't because we're still in the middle of this. Who are the isolates out here and why are they isolates? Who is this blue node in the middle of this red cluster? Who is this red node in the middle of this blue cluster? I actually don't know the answers to those questions yet. And who are these ties that are actually connecting these two components, the Republican and Democratic components? So there are some Republican and Democratic members who are apparently giving to cross partisans. And so we're really curious to dig into those terrific questions. I just don't have answers on them yet. Okay, but the takeaway here is all politics are party politics, and we can see that clearly in the graph. All right. Now what I want to do is dig down a little bit more on the degree centrality and betweenness centrality questions. And so what I did here was I calculated degree centrality and betweenness centrality on the Democratic network separate, the Democratic component of that big network I just showed from the Republican component of that network. So I separated them out by party, calculated degree and betweenness centrality on each of them, and then just started taking a look at it. So here I've got the, who have I got? These are the Republicans. So code 200 is Republicans. And this is organized by descending degree centrality. And it's just the first 10 rows. So Paul Ryan with the highest degree of 194, Kevin McCarthy at 185, Kathy McMorris Rodgers at 155. What do you know about those three people? Those are the party leaders. Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, Majority Leader of the House, Kathy McMorris Rodgers, another leadership committee person. So the people high in degree centrality in the Republican network are the party leaders. Sorry, I forgot I had a little animation about that. Remember that degree equals numbers and connections. So that's what we expect. We expect the party leaders to be using their leadership PACs to make inroads. Again, that was the Nancy Pelosi story I was telling earlier. Paul Ryan is going down that same kind of strategy. Here I do the same thing, but this is betweenness centrality on the whole network, not just the Republican slice or the Democratic component, but the whole network, the aggregated network. What's the betweenness centrality? And then let's organize those by descending betweenness. And what do I see? Well, this is interesting. We've got a Democrat and a Republican and a Democrat and a Democrat and a Democrat and a Democrat and a Republican and a Republican and a Republican. So we've got Democrats and Republicans mixed in where Richard Neal and Ryan Costello, one Democrat, one Republican, have huge outlying betweenness scores. Why? I don't really know, but I'm guessing that those are the people that were the edges that were connecting the two components. That's what I suspect is giving them high betweenness. I haven't looked into it far enough yet to be able to confirm that. Mike Doyle is popping up here as being high in betweenness, and we saw his name earlier in the Democratic Leadership PAC only network. Okay, so those with highest degree in the overall network are Republican Party leaders, but those with highest betweenness are a mix of partisans and not the party leaders, right? So that's interesting. We're not looking at the party leaders here. I mean, I guess Kathy McMorris Rodgers is in there, and she is, I suppose, in the top 10. But otherwise, we're not looking at party leaders that have high betweenness. We're looking at other people. So maybe these are people that were running scared. Maybe these are people in purple districts. Maybe these are people that were getting primaried. I actually am not sure of the answers to those questions yet. Okay, I keep forgetting about my animations, sorry. Those with high betweenness have low degrees. So that's one of the inferences we can draw here. If we do the community detection on the Republican and Democratic networks separately, interestingly, I get modularity of 0 on both of them. So on the one hand, it's kind of disappointing, but isn't it interesting that we had communities in the Leadership PAC only network, but in the network that's aggregated, we have no clustering. So I dig down a little further on that, and I use some code in R to tell R to treat the network as non-directed. Because as I said before, the community detection algorithms work a lot better with non-directed data. So let's just pretend these aren't directed because they are just edges. They are just connections after all. Let's pretend that they're just undirected edges. And when I do that, bingo, now I have a result. And in fact, the Democratic network is indeed more clustered than the Republican network. It's still a low level of clustering. We're still looking at like 3% for Democrats and just under 1% for Republicans. But it's consistent with the expectation, with the broader expectation at least. And using the non-directed version was a little bit more helpful for understanding the structure of the graph. But again, the evidence is consistent with expectation, with Democrats being clumpy and Republicans being less clumpy and more hierarchical. Okay, a little bit more on the community detection, and we're almost done here, I swear. And that is, we can ask R to just draw me a table of who are the members of the Democrats, the cluster. So I added cluster as a variable, as a column into my Democratic nodes attribute file. So I basically calculate the clustering algorithm. I call it dem.com for community. I add dem.com to the Democratic nodes attribute file, and I do the same thing for Republicans. And then I say, how many people are in each one of these clusters? So then I ask it to just tell me who they are. So cluster number 1, so these are just numbered here. There's 59 clusters. Cluster number 1 has 75 people in it. So there's one giant cluster with 75 people. And then the Democrats have one medium cluster here that's got 7 people in it. There's 2 tiny clusters that just have 2 members, and everybody else is isolated. So that's the clumpiness, so to speak, in the Democratic network. We could further dig down and look at the membership of those networks, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. In the Republican network, it looks like this. There is one cluster that has 129 members in it, and everybody else is isolate. That's what the community detection algorithm, the non-directed community detection algorithm, tells us. So that is not clumpy at all. That's a lot of isolationism. All right. I like the community detection plots in igraph, where you can, and I left the labels off of this to get, it's just hard to see. It's really messy. Again, here's our Democrats with 75 in the cluster. Here's our collection of 7. Actually, this isn't quite exactly what I was saying before, because here's a network of 4, here's a clump of 4, here's a clump of something else, but lots of isolates. So it's really hard to see the structure. There's just less community structure than I expected to observe. So there's some community structure, but not as much as I might have expected in the Democratic graph, and even less in the Republican graph. The Republicans are a mess, which kind of fits with national politics. All right, let me try to put a bow on this. Networks are everywhere, and we should study them. Everything in life is related to everything else, and networks are the tool that can help us get there. The tools in R with igraph and statnet and some other packages are just great tools for analysis and visualization. Be prepared to spend a lot of time cleaning data and a lot of time being very deliberate about thinking about what your nodes are and what your edges are, and using your organized workflow in order to keep that all straight. And your analysis should ultimately be driven by your theoretical expectations. So I'll leave it at that and welcome your questions. And I'm sorry I went on a bit long.
Oh, this is fantastic. So many questions, so many thoughts. I saw that someone had one last question in the chat. I think this was from a couple slides back. Is it possible to overlay the committees they were in? And I probably should have asked you that while the slide was up. I was trying to make sure you were able to get through your content, but yeah, could you overlay the committees that they were in?
I'm not sure what you mean by overlay the committees.
Maybe that person could come off of mute and explain a little bit more about that question. Which committees?
Oh,
on?
Yeah. Oh, you mean like congressional committees? Yeah. So I could add as an attribute, for example, which legislative committees the members of Congress serve on. Right, yeah, I understand what you're asking now. And then see if those clusters line up with those committees. Like maybe it's people who share, like maybe that's the Judiciary Committee cluster or the Ways and Means Committee cluster or something like that. I actually don't know. I haven't done that yet, but that's a great idea. I did go so far as to look if they were geographically organized, like is it members from the same state delegation? And it's not. There's a lot of variation across states. So they're not geographical clusters. Just eyeballing it, and I didn't show this in the presentation, but I did a quick just correlation plot to see if just plotting ideology with community that they were in, and there's no relationship. It just looks like noise. So ideology much to Sasha's chagrin, because this was one of her hypotheses, was that we could use ideology to predict the network structure. As far as I can tell, there's no relationship in the data. It just looks like random noise when we plot it against ideology.
Okay, great. And we've got another question. How do you handle data sets with thousands of nodes? Is there a point where network graphs become less useful because the visual becomes too crowded? Or would you focus more on the metrics centralities?
Yes. Great question. This is often the bane of my existence, right? So I work mostly not with election data, but more with congressional data. So in a typical House of Representatives, you've got 435 members, and if you do the combinatorics on that, that's 97,000 dyads, right? So I'm often plotting networks with 97,000 edges in them. And then I've got time. So I've got 97,000 times however many Congresses. So here's where we have to be really thoughtful about how to parse the data. What are the logical, rational, analytically driven ways of partitioning the data that are useful? So for example, somewhere in the slides, I think I had an example of one of the congressional caucus networks from the 109th Congress towards the beginning of the lecture, where in that graph, the reason it's not 97,000 edges is because we took the members of the 109th Congress, and then we looked at how many congressional caucus memberships they all shared. And then we said you had to share, we looked at the average number of joint caucus memberships, and only plotted the edges of those that had higher than average, right? So we just didn't show the edges or the nodes of those that are below average. So that's one way to partition the data. I do think, sometimes there's some experimentation that goes in there. I do think it's useful to pick kind of easy partitions that are logical to people. If the partitions that you come up with are really convoluted, then it starts to make it seem like you've stylized your data to fit whatever you're going for, right? So you don't want to make it seem like you're cooking it in order to meet your expectations. You want to choose partitions that are kind of reasonable, like I just cut it off at the mean or whatever, or I tried 5 different cut points and it didn't matter which cut point I used. That's the kind of stuff you can build into a footnote of a paper, but still give some face validity to the methodology.
Excellent question. I had a question. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just a second thought. Sorry to interrupt your thought there. To Angelica's question, one of the reasons I like igraph is because igraph tends to be one of the better packages for handling large networks, large data sets. Anything that's network data gets really big really fast because we're dealing with exponential functions. So often size is a problem. Size of data sets and size of network graphs can be a huge problem. These things can be incredibly computationally expensive to run. I'm working with a PhD student right now at George Mason in our conflict resolution program who is plotting, she's doing exponential random graph analyses on refugee networks. And she's been letting her ergom run for, last time I talked to her, it had been running for 3 days and it hadn't converged yet. So I'm probably going to tell her to just, cut that off. It's probably never going to converge. But that happens. These data sets get so big that they become very computationally expensive. So if you can run this stuff on, externally, if you have like a server that you can run them on, sometimes that can be really helpful. But as a package, I think igraph does a pretty good job of handling the large data sets. So I recommend igraph for the big stuff. And then I recommend, sampling can be really problematic in network data, but if you can sample, do it, and then find reasonable ways to partition the data.
Great advice. Thank you. Oh, another one. How do you decide what kind of layout to use? Circular, Fruchtenberg-Reingold?
Yeah, so the Fruchtenberg-Reingold algorithm is, so there's different layout algorithms that you can apply to a network graph. And I tend to prefer something similar to the Fruchtenberg-Reingold, and often, I think, if I'm not mistaken, igraph defaults to that one, I think, or one that's very similar. Essentially, what you want is for the graph to be such that the relative distance between the nodes is meaningful for describing the connection, right? In a typical graph, we're using Euclidean space, and where you are in Euclidean space and in which quadrant, for example, is meaningful, right? But in network graphs, Euclidean space is not meaningful. Like, I could take one of those spaghetti graphs I was showing you, rotate it 90 or 180 degrees, and it still is providing the exact same information, right? So the Euclidean space is not meaningful. What's meaningful is the relative space, the relative distance between nodes. And so you want to choose a layout algorithm that optimizes the relative distance between the nodes so that you can draw some inference from it. So that's why I don't like circle graphs either, because that forces the nodes into a structure that's not meaningful. I don't know why you would ever use a circle graph, to be honest with you. Maybe there are some good reasons for using it. Maybe in some transaction analyses where you want to see some flow from one to the other, a circle plot might be useful. But I'm usually interested in distances being a meaningful metric of the relationship between nodes. So that's why I prefer those algorithms.
Great. Okay. I had a question. Definitely beyond the scope of what we talked about, but just kind of curious to know your thoughts about it. I saw that you used a snapshot of data from one time point, but do you ever look at a time dimension to see, maybe networks and how they're changing over time?
Yeah, so networks in time, there are some new tools that have been recently developed for analyzing networks across time. It adds a whole, like we're already dealing with multiple dimensions with network data. So time is just like adding another dimension to the universe that makes things kind of complicated. For example, in the research, in a manuscript that I'm working on right now, I've got network data from 1993 to 2016. I treat it as like a panel. So it's longitudinal data that's sort of a series of cross sections essentially. But it's members of Congress, and so they carry across time. But analytically, then we need statistical tools that will allow us to either control for time or leverage time. So I apply panel models to data, to network data using a dyadic unit of analysis. If I don't know if I'm starting to speak Greek to you. This is more on the stats side, which we didn't really get into in today's talk. But in that way, you can incorporate time as a useful dimension of your network analysis in a statistical tool. In visualizations and descriptive analyses, I think it's really hard, but there's some cool things you can do with like lattice plots or trellis plots where I've done like, here's different, like 12 different spaghetti graphs of Congress on some particular edge attribute. And you can see how the structure of the network changes across time, where each element of the graph is a different snapshot or cross section. Right. And so that can be useful for seeing how a network might develop across time. But again, you want to make sure that you're doing apples to apples comparisons. One of the reasons I like studying Congress with networks is because Congress is a contained body. Like there's only 435 members of the House. Actually, it should be bigger, and hopefully someday it will be, but that's what it is right now. And but if you're talking about, studying some population of people, and you're looking at networks. Let's say you're studying viruses. Let's say you're a COVID researcher, and you're looking at how virus spreads. Networks are really useful for that. The problem there is that there's no bounds to that population. You're essentially talking about the population of the whole world. Right, so you can't sample from a network because you don't know where the bounds of it are. It's really hard to draw inference from, and it's hard then to draw cross sections that you can compare across time because it's so unbounded. So for that reason, it's sometimes useful to have populations that are bounded in some way, like Congress is. So if you can put a reasonable theoretical bound on the population of study, the population of interest, and that can be really useful for network analysis.
Great, and I have one last question that was asked earlier, going back to Dr. Victor's note on data management. I'd love recommendations, books, articles, et cetera, on cleaning data, creating data sets and variables, data transformation, et cetera. Courses and online tutorials typically provide nice clean data sets. I'm working on a personal project with survey data and trying to figure out the best way to clean, transform, and document it. And I'd also add to that what we were talking about before, the Robert Long recommendations you had earlier. You said there was a book that or a reference that you would share with us.
Let me see if I can, I might be able to pull that reference and then we can get it in the chat. No, Zotero, I do not want to restart you right now.
Yeah.
By the way, if you're not using Zotero, I highly recommend it for references management. Long, that's what I'm looking at.
How do you spell that?
So, Zotero, Zotero. So it's better than BibTeX. It's better than, I don't know, whatever people are using these days. I love Zotero. It integrates with your web browser. So you click a button and it pulls citations with Google Scholar. It has a plugin for, word processing, for making easy bibliographies. It's just awesome. And of course, I didn't find, it's not in my Zotero. How is that possible? Robert is not the right first name. Is that why I can't find it? Do I have the wrong first name? Here it is, I think. Yeah, I have the wrong name. That's why I can't find him. Okay, so the book is J. Scott Long. And it's the workflow of data analysis. He's got different versions. Actually, the tips that I pulled were from an old book that I have of his that are workflow for data analysis using Stata, but I think he has new updated stuff. He's a stats and sociology person that's got a pretty big repertoire of material out there. And I think, I want to say he has one that's also for R, but now that I'm saying that, I'm not positive.
Okay.
But somebody should just go check Amazon.
Cool. Any other last minute questions or comments maybe before we wrap? This has been awesome. I'm looking for an excuse now to I do a lot of well, obviously work for my day job, but I work on personal projects too. So now I'm just kind of looking for an excuse to analyze some kind of social network data. I do a lot of social justice analyses. So now I'm kind of brainstorming, okay, what kind of social justice kind of project could I use to leverage some of these tools? I think that would be kind of cool.
I'd be happy to chat with you about that. That sounds really interesting. And I will say also, there are a number of terrific, like if you just start Googling, igraph and Google some of the functions or things you're trying to do, there's some awesome tutorials and things that are out there. In fact, I should have put them in the slides. Oganyova at Rutgers, Katio.net. Let me find this real fast. She's got some of the best stuff out there. She's awesome, and she does tutorials every year at the PaulNet conference. She'd give it Catherine Ogyanova. I don't know how to say her name. I think it's Russian. So I'm sorry. Apologies to her that I'm mispronouncing her name. She goes by Katya, but she is great, and she's got terrific resources on her website with tutorials and examples and lots of stuff on igraph, and I think she's got some statnet stuff too. But she's particularly great with visualizations and data visualizations. And she does a lot of stuff with David Lazar in his lab, also at Northeastern. And they've got a lot of great network stuff going on in that lab as well. So that's just one. Solomon Messing. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just thinking of some of the other like tutorials and things that I've used over the years. So Solomon Messing, he used to be at Pew, but I think he works for Facebook now, if I remember correctly. But he's still got some stuff out there. There's also Borgatti, Steve Borgatti, although he doesn't have as much stuff in R. He's got stuff outside of R, but he's got great, just if you just want to learn networks, he's got really good things. Who's the other guy I'm trying to think of? Oh, Barabasi, Laszlo Barabasi. He's got a terrific website with all kinds of resources on it as well.
Someone asked
about. So anyway, there's others, but go ahead.
Someone just asked about a reference for network analysis in general, maybe just for getting some general understanding about network analysis.
Yeah, I should have built you a bibliography. So the Bible of network analysis is Wasserman and Faust. Oh gosh, I just typed that wrong. Wasserman and Faust.
And if you'd like, since you're going to send me the slides anyway, if you want to just maybe shoot me a text or something like that has those references that you were looking for. I think.
Sure.
Cool.
I'd be happy to. I'll send you I'll add a slide onto the end of the talk that includes some bibliographic references, because there's a lot of great stuff out there. Newman as well. Yeah, that's a good one. Somebody put that. Newman's got great stuff too.
Excellent.
I need to go into my office and like look at my shelf of network books and just like tell you the titles, but
we are learning so much from you, and I'm sure I'll be bugging you about certain things, like I said, because I plan on, and that's how I learn. I like to try things out. So I find a project and then I just start working through all the challenges and transform the data and wrangle it and all that stuff. And so, and then something comes out of it. So yeah, I definitely will be trying some of these techniques. But yeah, I want to thank you for coming out. Thank you for staying over a few minutes extra, and for sharing all these great insights from your experience with network data analysis, with political data in particular. Yeah, I'll definitely make sure that I make these slides available and the video recording available on the Meetup event page. And I'll also post a link to Twitter, as I usually do. So please join me in thanking our speaker for taking the time to share with us. And yeah, I hope to see you all at a future Our Ladies Dallas Meetup event. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciated being with you, and thank you, Sadiqa, for reaching out and pushing me. You had to work hard to get me to agree to do it, and it was awesome. I'm so glad you did.
She's interesting. I want her. I really want her. So thank you for responding to that invitation. I really appreciate it.
Terrific. Okay. I'm so glad. Thank you.
All right. This is great. All right. Well, thanks everyone, and have a great night. Or morning, wherever you are. I know everybody's in different places. Okay, but everybody take care. Good night.
Take care. Bye-bye.